Peace be with you. Friends, with our readings for this weekend, we are on very holy ground because we're dealing with the imagery, symbolism, and theology of the suffering servant. It's an image of extraordinary importance in our great tradition. And we start now in our first reading. It's taken from the book of the prophet Isaiah. I might have mentioned this before to you, but the scholars divide Isaiah, the first 39 chapters. They think is associated with the historical Isaiah. Then the central section, chapters 40 through 55, they call it Deutero, or second Isaiah, associated most likely with a figure around the time of the return of the captives from Babylon. Then they think 55 through the end would be a third Isaiah, but I won't get into all those details. What's important is the suffering servant imagery is taken from this middle section, this Deutero Isaiah, dealing with the triumphant return of the exiles. So this section is particularly lyrical and beautiful. It's the language of triumph and comfort and return. It's joyful. Listen to how it begins. Here are the opening lines of chapter 40. Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem, that she has served her term, and her penalty is paid. Good news. The exiles have paid the price. They're now coming home. And we hear throughout this section of the overwhelming majesty and power of God. Listen, here's an example. See, the Lord God comes with might, and his arm rules for him. All the nations are as nothing before him. To whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Lord. This is the powerful God of Israel now bringing his people back triumphantly from exile. This section's filled with the language of light and hope. God, who seems to have abandoned his people, now reveals himself as gracious and powerful. Now, sprinkled throughout this section of Isaiah, sprinkled throughout this triumphant section, are these poems, let's call them, there are 4 of them, dealing with the figure of the servant of Yahweh, a special servant who will do the work of the Lord associated with salvation. Now, here's the first reference. You'll find it in chapter 42, which is a particularly beautiful and famous chapter of Isaiah. Listen, here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice for the earth. Okay, there's the triumphant, powerful God of Israel bringing the exiles back, and now he's going to appoint a servant who will establish justice not just for Israel, but through Israel for all the nations of the world. Okay, it fits in perfectly with the triumphant, powerful tone of Deutero Isaiah, this servant of the Lord. But then things start getting more complicated. Listen now, this is our reading for today. It's taken from the 50th chapter of Isaiah, so right in the middle of this second section. And the servant is being further described. And listen, I gave my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who plucked my beard. My face I did not shield from buffets and spitting. Okay, wait a minute. The readers of Isaiah must have thought, wait a minute. I thought we're talking about triumph here. God bringing the exiles back, appointing a servant who will now bring his justice to all the nations, right? Isn't that what we're talking about? And now he's not only enduring these things, he's giving his back to those who will beat him, his cheeks to those who will pluck his beard. He's not even shielding his face when they spit at him. Wait a minute. I don't get it. This is the servant you're talking about? Now, go to chapter 53, which is the most famous of these suffering servant songs. He goes, now that's the motif. He's a servant of the Lord, but he's a suffering servant. Now listen from 53. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him. Nothing in his appearance that we would desire him. He was despised and rejected by others, a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity, and is one from whom others hide their faces. Okay, I'm still not getting this. This is the triumphant servant of Yahweh who will bring justice to all the world. You know how important the appearance of the king was in the ancient world? And it hasn't changed that much. How appearance conscious we are about our leaders, that they look good, they look impressive. But this one, no form or majesty that we should look at him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. And then, you'd think the triumphant servant of the Lord would be someone full of power and majesty, but here he's despised. He's rejected. He's a man of suffering and acquainted with infirmity. Okay, this is a little bit puzzling. And it gets even more puzzling. Listen now, I'm still in chapter 53. Surely he, the servant, has borne our iniquities and carried our diseases. We accounted him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. Okay. Here's who indeed will bring justice and salvation to all the world. But how will he do it? What's very clear now, not in the customary way, not in the way of worldly kings, not through armies and through conquest, but precisely by bearing the suffering of the world, by taking upon himself the punishment that is due to the world. What could this mean? Now imagine people for the first time encountering these texts from Isaiah, and they're wondering, well, I get it, I suppose, but how does this work? What does it mean? Well, we can think of some ready examples, I think. The great Maximilian Kolbe, the priest at Auschwitz who gave himself to save another man who had been chosen for execution. Kolbe simply came forward and said, I'm a Catholic priest, take me. And so Kolbe, by his wounds, by his bruises, by his self-sacrifice, saved this other man. Less dramatic examples, but the mother of a child who stays up all night, denies herself sleep that she might care for a suffering child. She bears in her own body the suffering of her child. The dad who brings his kid to skating practice at 5:30 in the morning. That's less dramatic than Maximilian Kolbe, but still the same idea. By his suffering, he brings life and betterment to his son. Or think of a friend who says, I'm going to donate my own kidney that my friend might live. So we begin to get it. We begin to see that we can bring life to others. We can bring salvation, it just means healing, to others, precisely by taking upon ourselves suffering. Okay. All of this, I suggest to you, all of this, let's say Isaiah, the second part is written, they think around the year 500 BC. So for all these years, Israel had carried within its mind and heart this idea, this image of the suffering servant. God's servant who will bring justice to the world precisely through suffering. Okay? With that in mind, we come to the famous scene which is in our gospel, the scene of Jesus and the disciples at Caesarea Philippi. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And of course, it's Simon Peter that gives the correct answer. You're the Christ, the Son of God. Okay, I've preached often on that passage. Consult those homilies, but I want to focus now on the follow-up. Once Peter makes the confession, yes, you are the Christ, you're the Son of God. Listen now, here's in our gospel. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. Now, I want you to, friends, to move into that kind of wrenching psychological space the disciples must have been in. They watched their master at work, teaching and healing and performing miracles, and they're guessing, they're wondering, is he the one? Is he the Messiah? And then at this climactic moment, Peter, speaking for all of them, says, yes, you are. You're the Christ. You're the Son of God. I mean, how thrilled they must have been. Here's the long-awaited Mashiach, the anointed of Israel. Here's the new David who will drive away the enemies of the nation. Here's the one who will establish justice, yes, for Israel and for the whole world. But then Jesus reminds them of these strange passages from the book of the prophet Isaiah. What he's saying is, remember what it means to be the anointed of the Lord. Remember what it means to be the servant of the Lord. He must suffer greatly, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed. At the end of his life, Jesus was indeed persecuted, arrested, beaten, spat upon, dragged through the streets, nailed to a Roman cross, endured all of that suffering, and died. Who is he? Well, Peter confessed correctly. He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's the servant who'll bring God's justice to the world. How will he do it? Precisely as Isaiah predicted. Not through worldly power and triumph, but by taking upon himself the sin and cruelty and dysfunction of the world and swallowing it up in the ever greater divine mercy. Jesus journeying all the way to the bottom of human dysfunction so as to bring into that darkest place something of the light of God's forgiveness. It was precisely in his suffering that he accomplished this great act of justice. You know, in Zeffirelli's Jesus of Nazareth, which I watched as a kid, it came out in the 1970s. It's a wonderful film about the life of Jesus. And it stars many of the biggest stars in the world at the time, including the great Laurence Olivier. People saw him as, at the time, the greatest actor in the world. And he plays Nicodemus, the one who came at night to talk to Jesus. But Nicodemus is there as the procession with the cross is going on, as Jesus is moving toward Calvary. And they show Nicodemus, and the great face of Laurence Olivier is communicating this anguish and confusion. But then he begins to recite exactly these passages from Deutero-Isaiah. He begins to recite the passages dealing with the suffering servant. By his wounds we are healed. It represents the moment when the church began fully to understand what was at stake. Yes, he is the Mashiach. Yes, he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Yes, he is the one who will bring God's salvation to all the world. But he will do it precisely by bearing the pain and suffering of the world. Friends, move into the power of these texts. Can I recommend, get out your Bibles. Go to that central section, chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah. Read those passages, and maybe like Laurence Olivier in the film, repeat those passages. They'll help you understand precisely how Jesus brought salvation to the world. And God bless you. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Peace be with you. Friends, we come today to the last Sunday of the liturgical year, the Feast of Christ the King. I always think of the liturgical year as kind of this great procession, at the end of which comes the most important figure, the King. Because in a way, this sums up what the Christian life is all about. Is Jesus the King of your life? Is he the Lord of your life in every sense? All the other celebrations of the year, in a way, are asking that question. They're leading you toward that conclusion that Christ must be king. Can we say that he's our dominus, to use that Latin word? I like it because it sounds like dominate in English, and that's okay. He's meant to be the one who dominates. He's the Lord of every aspect of our lives. Can we say with Paul, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me? That means he's become the king of every aspect of my life. Because here's the point, everybody. If we say anything but that, we are basically horsing around with Christianity and not living it seriously. Let me say that again. If we say anything other than Christ is the king of the whole of my life, I'm horsing around with Christianity. I'm not living it properly. If we pay lip service to Jesus, yeah, wasn't he a wonderful figure from the ancient world? Wasn't he an inspiring ethical exemplar? We're fooling around with Christianity. We're not truly living it. If we pay attention to him for a few minutes every Sunday and then we live the rest of our lives as though he doesn't even exist, then we are not treating him as the king. We are playing around with Christianity. Shift the metaphor. If we let him into 1 or 2 rooms of our house, but not the rest of the house, we're horsing around. We're not taking it seriously. To say Christ is king, it means he commands every room in the house. He commands as Lord, as Dominus, every aspect of my life. Anything less than that is not real Christianity. Okay, that's what the feast, I think, of Christ the King means. But I don't want to leave it there just as an abstract statement. Let's get concrete about it. What does it mean to say that Jesus is the king of your family life and your sexual life? Well, he's talking about sex. I might as well start with that topic. It'll get your attention. It means, first of all, you treat every member of your family as an end and not merely as a means. That's sort of philosophically stated. That's a very important principle. To treat someone as a means is to use that person for your own advantage. I'm going to use you to get something I want. To love is never to treat a human being, especially a member of your family, as a means to your own advancement, your own pleasure, your own projects and plans. No. Every person in your family is an end in himself or herself. How do you treat your wife, your husband, your kids? As ends or as means? If Jesus is king of your life, you'll never use them that way. Our sexual lives, that's simply a means for our own pleasure? Or have we situated our sexuality within the context of love? See, to make Christ the king means every aspect of your life comes under the aegis of love, because that's who Jesus is. He comes into the world as the bearer of the divine love. If I'm living my sexual life in a way that I'm just using other people for my pleasure, Christ is not the king of my life. Ask yourself those honest questions. How about this, if I can just get even a little more concrete? How about the number of children you have? The Bible likes big families. Be fruitful and multiply is one of God's great commands. But many, I think, in our culture and society, let's make sure our families are really small so that we can also realize our projects and plans. Is Christ king of your sexual life and your family life if you're thinking predominantly in that way? It's a challenge. Okay? What does it mean to say that Christ is the Lord of your professional life? So all of you who are pursuing a profession, going to work every day. I think, first of all, it might mean if you're involved in a job that is fundamentally immoral in orientation or purpose, you got to get out of it. Oh, hey, it's a good job. I make a lot of money. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If Christ is king of your professional life, that means you can't be in a job that's fundamentally immoral in purpose and orientation. What if your company is pursuing strategies and policies that are immoral? It means you got to raise your voice in protest. You got to make clear that this is morally wrong. If Christ is Lord, he's king of your professional life. It means, I think, furthermore, you should bring, whenever you can, your faith into the workplace. I don't mean in an overbearing, wear on your lapel sort of way. But I mean, take advantage of the opportunities to evangelize those around you, to let you know that you're a Christian, that you're a Catholic, that you're proud of your faith. That means making Christ king of your professional life. That money isn't everything. You know, how often in our professional lives we think, well, that's my main value here. There's nothing wrong with money making. Of course we need it to support our families and so on. Nothing wrong with it in itself. But if the dominant concern of my professional life is making as much money as I can and not instantiating the kingdom of God, well, then Christ is not king of your professional life. Somebody else is, by the way. What does it mean to say that Jesus is the king of your personal life? How about this? This has helped me a little bit. It means that in your personal life, you should feel comfortable doing everything you do in private in such a way that Jesus could be sitting right next to you. Let me say that again. So, in your personal life, the way you're seeking entertainment or the way you're seeking diversion, would you be comfortable, whatever you're doing, to have Jesus sitting right next to you while you do it? If not, he's not king of your personal life. Oh no, I better keep him, in another room of the house. No, whatever you're doing, watching television, you're on the internet, you're going to a ball game, whatever it is in your personal life, your friendships, are you comfortable if Christ is sitting right next to you while you do it? Then he's king of your personal life. It means, everybody, if you're involved in something egregiously immoral in your personal life, and even if no one else knows about it, you've kept it hidden from the prying eyes of other people. But you can't keep it hidden from the eyes of Christ the King. If you're engaged in something egregiously immoral in your personal life, you got to stop it. Otherwise, he's not king of your personal life. It means that your friendships are wholesome. They lead you in a positive direction. If you have friends, they're decent people, or they're funny, or they're entertaining, or they distract you, but they're not leading you down the right moral path, then Christ is not king of your personal life. Ask yourself that question. Furthermore, it means that you're in steady contact with the Lord through prayer. Prayer is something very private. I spent an hour this morning, as I always do, doing my holy hour, making sure, and with all my flaws, believe me, I got them, but trying to make sure that I maintain a steady connection with the Lord so that my personal life and all that I do is dedicated to him. That's what I do in my holy hour in the morning, is I'll say, Lord, here's what I'm going to do today. May all of it be ordered to you. May all of it be under your aegis. Is prayer basic in your life, or is it something you do on rare occasion? If it is, then he's not Lord of your personal life. How about the sacraments, so fellow Catholics? How often do you attend the sacraments? Marriage has gone down, baptisms have gone down, confession for many years has gone down. This can't be healthy in the life of the church. If the sacraments are the privileged and primary means by which we access Christ, if they become something we do from time to time, then Christ is not king of our personal lives. If he isn't, make him so. Okay, let's keep going. What does it mean to say that Christ is the king of our minds? Paul says, may that same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. He speaks too of the renewal of our minds. Well, it means that you think deeply about your faith. How many Catholics have fallen into a kind of indifference when it comes to the deep questions? Oh, that's too much for me. I can't think about all that. I'll give my mind over to lots of other things, but not over to the faith. When's the last time you read a really serious book about the faith? And I don't mean some little pop superficial thing. I mean a serious book that engages your mind and leads you down interesting intellectual paths in regard to the faith. If you're not, then he's not the king of your mind. When's the last time you looked into serious apologetics? I do this professionally, but there's a massive disaffiliation on the part of young people from the faith. You know what they say time and again in all the surveys? They never got their questions answered. No one explained the faith to them. They got a dumbed down Catholicism. Well, Look, we met the enemy and it's us. If we're not thinking deeply about the faith, then we're not able to explain it to our young people. If you can't explain the faith and give others a reason for the hope that's in you, as St. Peter said, then you're not making Christ the king of your intellectual life. If all your intellectual energy is given over to, worldly pursuits, he's not king of your mind. Would you be happy if your knowledge of literature or history or economics remained at the 6th grade level? But for so many, it seems to me, their knowledge of the faith remains at the 6th grade level. If that's true, then Christ is not king of your intellectual life. Finally, what does it mean to say that Christ is king of your body? Oh, Christ, he's king of my soul or king of my mind. No, but he must be king of your whole person. It means you treat your body with respect. You don't abuse it through the misuse of alcohol or drugs or excessive eating and drinking. I mean, look, many in our society do that all the time. If they do, Christ is not king of their bodies. It means you practice temperance, that great classical virtue. It means you're committed to being as physically fit as you can. Why? Well, because this body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. It's meant to be a vehicle of mission. If my body is a wreck, I can't do the mission Christ has for me. And if that's the case, then he's not king of my body. It means, you're not taking the resurrection of the body seriously. The hope of Christianity is not that the soul escapes from the body. Our hope is that our bodies are resurrected. Well, that means Christ is king of my body if I'm attentive to this fact. Okay, we could get more and more specific if you want. I've just given you a few examples. But let me just close with this. One thing I love about the Feast of Christ the King is it proves that the spiritual life, everybody, is not a democracy. I'm all in favor of democracy, don't get me wrong. I don't like kings politically. I'm a proud American. I'm glad we got rid of the king. I like democratic political systems. But the spiritual life is not a democracy. Christ is not the president. He's not a prime minister. He's not the leader of a party, because all those figures can be voted out. All those figures can be more or less ignored when they're not suiting our purposes. But to say that Christ is king means that he's the dominus, he's the Lord of the whole of our life. To understand that and take it seriously is to be a true Christian. Not to get it, to marginalize him, is to be horsing around with Christianity. So, Feast of Christ the King, we got to make a decision. Does everything belong to him? Does he belong in every room of the house? Is he king or something else? Everything will depend upon that decision. And God bless you. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to share it and to subscribe to my YouTube channel. This collection represents, as you say, about the last 5-6 years of my occasional writings, by which I mean I'm invited to give a lecture, I'm invited to give a presentation, I'm invited here or there, and asked to talk about a particular aspect of the church's life. And what I've tried to do since I've been named a bishop, and even going back when I was a rector of the seminary, and I'm in full-time administrative work, I wanted to keep my hand in the game. So I always accepted on purpose every year, 2 or 3 invitations to do higher level research and writing. So this book represents about the last 5-6 years of that kind of writing over a range of topics. And my hope, Brandon, is that anybody interested in the life of the church today, and theology, liturgy, philosophy, the culture, etc., would find something interesting in this book.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director. We're here for another one of our discussion episodes of the podcast with Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey Brandon, always a joy to see you too.
In this episode, we're going to be discussing Bishop Barron's new book. It's titled Renewing Our Hope, and today is the launch day. It just came out. It's an exciting book which covers several topics from around the church, including things like theology, evangelization, philosophy, and more. We're going to go in depth into several of the chapters in the book. But before we do, Bishop, maybe a little update. How about what are you reading these days? Give us a little taste.
Well, one thing during this COVID period, I've had more time for reading. Sort of my monkish side has come out a bit more. What I'm reading with great interest right now is Robert Alter's magnificent Old Testament translation and commentary. And it's in connection with the Word on Fire Bible, other projects that I'm working on. But Alter is a great scholar of Hebrew and of ancient Jewish literature, and I used him a lot when I was working on my 2 Samuel book from several years ago. I used his commentary on the David literature. Well, this is the whole Old Testament, all of it. So the whole thing is about 3,500 pages, and I've plowed through the book of Genesis, and now I'm just on to Exodus. And I'm going to read the whole Bible with his commentary. So I'm underway with that. To me, it's, the Bible is always a great joy to read, and there is something mysterious. I'm sure you sense this too, Brandon. We read a lot, but there is something about reading the Bible where you sense the real presence of the Holy Spirit, And Alter is a Jewish scholar, more of a secularized kind of background. He himself is not, super religious. And in a way, that's okay, because what I'm looking for in his commentary is more of the language, the philology, the history, the background. So anyway, that's been a kind of a joyful project I've been on recently.
And it's like, what is it? It's like 3 massive books that he's written, right?
3 beautiful big hardcovers, and the whole thing I think is about 3,500 pages.
Well, about 5 years ago, you released an academic collection of essays. It was titled Exploring Catholic Theology, Essays on God, Liturgy, and Evangelization. It was published by Baker Academic. Mm-hmm. You also just mentioned your commentary on 2 Samuel. And these books have a bit of a different tone and aim than a lot of the more popular level stuff that you write and your YouTube videos, the podcasts. It worries me sometimes that a lot of our listeners aren't aware of that side of you, and I think it would be good for them to be exposed to higher level theology and philosophy and reflection. I sometimes think, if Bishop Barron wasn't on YouTube, if he wasn't writing these popular level books, you would probably be considered one of the premier Catholic intellectuals of our time. I think you're one of the brightest minds reflecting on these questions. And so that was the impetus for this new collection of academic essays and scholarly talks. Again, it just released today. It's titled Renewing Our Hope, Essays for the New Evangelization. It was published by our good friends at Catholic University of America Press, so your alma mater there. Shout out to John Martino, the talented editor there. And listeners can find out more about the book by visiting the website wordonfireshow.com/renew. That's where you can get your copy of it, wordonfireshow.com/renew. It has 17 chapters, it's about 320 pages, and it covers a wide range of topics, everything from evangelization to theology to the sexual abuse crisis, the priesthood, relativism, liberalism, and even contemporary movies. So a very wide-ranging book. Bishop, maybe for starters, let's talk about the impetus for this book. How did it come about? Why a book like this?
Well, let me first say, Brandon, something about what you mentioned at the outset, namely the kind of academic versus popular distinction. It's a truism to say, but if you do both serious academic writing and more popular writing, you are perforce better known for your popular writing because that goes out more widely. Also, I made a decision many years ago to do the work we're doing right now, namely evangelizing and catechizing through the new media. I wanted to do both those things. I was trained as an academic theologian in languages and philosophy and theology and so on and so forth. And of the books I've written, I think more than half could be characterized as serious academic books. But again, perforce, they're lesser known than the more popular books. I think it's, to my mind, very important to operate in both ways. A lot of the great theologians over the centuries have done just that, by the way. You look at the highest level theologians, they also did, we call it more catechetical writing or more sermonizing. Think of Aquinas's sermons on the Creed. Think of Augustine's more catechetical homilies. You read the homilies of Augustine, they're not like the De Trinitate or like the City of God. They're in a more popular vein. I mean, so I've always felt it's good to do both those things. It's one thing to sit in the sidelines and complain about, the decline in Catholic catechetics since the council and the dumbing down, and which I've done. I've complained about that, but also I've tried to do something about it. So that's why we've reached out in the more popular vein and through the social media. But all that time, I've continued doing higher level academic work. This collection represents, as you say, about the last 5-6 years of my occasional writings, by which I mean I'm invited to give a lecture, I'm invited to give, and what I've tried to do since I've been named a bishop, and even going back when I was a rector of the seminary, and I'm in full-time administrative work, I wanted to keep my hand in the game. So I always accepted on purpose every year, 2 or 3 invitations to do higher level research and writing. So this book represents about the last 5-6 years of that kind of writing over a range of topics. And my hope, Brandon, is that anybody interested in the life of the church today, and theology, liturgy, philosophy, the culture, etc., would find something interesting in this book. As I say, it's occasional writings, meaning I think you can move around this book, you read this chapter, that chapter. You need not maybe plow through it cover to cover, but you could benefit from an essay that interests you here and so on. But I've always tried to be both and when it comes to the higher level academic and the more popular work. I think they're both good, they're both important.
Readers will notice that on the cover of the book, it features a foreword by Archbishop Christophe Pierre. Who is he and why is this significant?
Archbishop Pierre is the Apostolic Nuncio to the United States, so he's the Pope's representative. And I was just delighted when he agreed to write that preface. I think Catholic U approached him and asked him. And so he's someone who very much represents the Pope to the whole country, but has a special relationship to the bishops. And I think that's reflected in his preface, that he's talking about a bishop, engaging in theological reflection at this level and the importance of that. So I was delighted and very honored that he agreed to write that preface.
Well, let's walk through some of the specific chapters. Again, we're not going to go through all 17 of them, but I thought we could kind of float through and take a tour. There's 4 major sections of the book by which the chapters are arranged. So the first one is renewing our mission. Part 2 is renewing our minds. Part 3 is renewing the church, and part 4 is renewing our culture. So I'll start with this first part, renewing our mission. The first 2 essays in the book are all about the nuns. The first one is Looking for the Nuns, which was a talk you gave at the University of Notre Dame, and then Evangelizing the Nuns, which was your 2017 Erasmus lecture for First Things. And in both essays, you explore some of the intellectual roadblocks preventing the unaffiliated from believing in religion. Why are these intellectual roadblocks important? A lot of people say we need to just really get better at loving the unaffiliated, welcoming them, inviting them, getting them involved in community. Those intellectual things are not really what they're struggling with. Why is it important that we focus on those?
I should say first, you and I have clarified this a lot, but when we say the nuns, we don't mean the N-U-N-S. I'm not trying to it's the N-O-N-E-S, right? Those who are unaffiliated from the faith. I've said this before, Brandon, that those who claim that young people who have disaffiliated don't have a lot of intellectual questions have not accompanied many young people. I've been doing it for the past 20 years or more. Accompanying, yes. Reaching out in friendship, yes. Inviting into a shared life, yes. I'm in complete support of all those moves. But as I say, you spend even a very short time with a young, unaffiliated person, they got tons of questions. I don't care what you want to call them. I just call them honest questions. What should we do in response? Oh, just say, let's have another pizza. No, how about providing smart answers to honest questions? Some people don't like the word apologetics. I don't care. Use another word if you want. I'd call it giving smart answers to honest intellectual questions. Young people have lots and lots and lots of those questions. And the church has got to be, in my judgment, a lot better at providing compelling answers. So, to me, look at any of the surveys of those who've disaffiliated. And you and I have talked about this. What's the number one reason in survey after survey? I've stopped believing in the claims of the church. So everyone wants it, I guess, to be, oh, I'm angry at priests, or it's the sex abuse scandal. And those indeed are ingredient in the problem. But number one, time and again, intellectual disagreement. And so, yeah, I think it's exceptionally important to address those questions and address them seriously. That's what I do in both of those essays.
So again, that's part one, renewing our mission. It's all about evangelization, especially of those who have no religious belief. And I think a lot of that will be familiar with listeners of this podcast. Yeah. So let's hop forward to part two. I want to spend a little more time on this. This one is titled Renewing Our Minds. And there are several fascinating essays in this part. One of them is on Derrida, Aquinas, and the Dilemma of Divine Generosity. That was a lecture you gave when you received your honorary doctorate from the Angelicum. There's another one on John Henry Newman and the New Evangelization. There's an essay on the intellectual influences on Pope Francis, which is kind of some groundbreaking work that I don't think many others have explored. But I want to talk about one essay in particular. It's titled How von Balthasar Changed My Mind. What stuck out to me is it's rare for serious theologians to flat out admit, I used to believe something, and then I read this, and now I believe something else. Like a lot of the thinkers I read are pretty intransigent in their own beliefs, and they won't kind of admit this development of thought. But again, you have a whole essay here that reading von Balthasar changed your mind in a significant way. How so? What did he change?
Yeah, I mean, it's a somewhat complicated issue, but to state it simply, the move from a dominant liberal model of doing theology to a different way of doing it. And now I'm using that word in a very particular way. I know it's a very slippery term, liberal. What I mean here is the view that you begin theology primarily with experience. So you begin with a personal, generic experience of the sacred or of the divine. Think of now from Friedrich Schleiermacher, religion begins with the feeling of absolute dependency. Move up through Paul Tillich, the feeling of being ultimately concerned. Come up to Karl Rahner, who is massively influential for my generation of Catholic seminarians, priests, and theologians. Rahner says we begin with the experience of being in the presence of absolute mystery. Now, without going into all the details, are those experiences valid? Yeah, they are, I think. They're legitimate. We really have those experiences, and they do orient us toward the sacred. What's the danger? The danger is that very often the specificity of biblical religion is occluded, or is at least marginalized. The stress is so on generic experience, which does indeed link us, let's say, to all spiritually minded people around the world, and that's not a bad thing. So I'm not bad-mouthing liberalism. In fact, I've been careful to say I'm not anti-liberal, I'm post-liberal. By which I mean I'm happy to take in the value of this liberal approach, but what Balthasar helped me to see, and this is for me the demarcation from a very Rahnerian formation that I had as a young man to Balthasarian. For Balthasar, I think he too would say yes to what Rahner saw, but he would tend to say theology gets really interesting precisely where Rahner stops. It gets really interesting when we move from our generic experience of the sacred to the specificity of what God has disclosed to us in Revelation. So for Balthasar, it's not primarily my experience of the sacred, it's the form of revelation that's been given to me precisely in the history of Israel, which culminates in the one who is the glory of his people, Israel. In the Christ, the Gestalt, the form, he says, that discloses the divine mind and heart. In the beauty and specificity of Christ, theology opens up and becomes something really splendid and moves us to missionary action. It's all of that let's say in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was doing my doctoral work and then my early years as a teacher, began to change my mind. And in many ways, Brandon, Word on Fire came up out of that conversion. So read the essay for all the details, but that's the basic way that Balthasar, even to say change my mind, that's the title of the book that I contributed to. But something like, I'd say a development, is a more accurate way to put it, without leaving behind the liberal approach. It's something really new and fresh developing beyond it.
We're talking about Bishop Barron's new book titled Renewing Our Hope, Essays for the New Evangelization, just released today by Catholic University of America Press. We're talking through some of the chapters here, and we're covering part 2. We just looked at one of the essays in part 2. This section is all about renewing our minds. Let's look at another essay in this chapter. It's one titled, Why the Divine Simplicity Matters. And this was occasioned by your exchange with Dr. William Lane Craig, the famous Protestant evangelist and philosopher. We don't need to go into all the details of the essay or even the doctrine of divine simplicity, but why is it that this doctrine is so crucial to you and not just secondary? Because I know William Lane Craig was arguing just the opposite. This is kind of a secondary thing. Believe it if you want, don't if you don't want to. Why is it so crucial?
And first of all, it's a joy, Brandon, to hear you rehearse for me the occasions for these various writings, because it brings back lovely memories of, like, for example, being at the Angelicum, being in Oxford with the Newman talk. And this one, the dialogue with William Lane Craig, which I enjoyed immensely. Someone I have great respect for. Craig, who took on the new atheists at a time when most Christians weren't willing or able to do it. And I very much admire the way he did that. So it was a pleasure. That was my first chance to meet him and spend a wonderful day with him. And we had a higher level academic exchange, and the topic that I proposed was this one of the divine simplicity, because I know he takes a different view. In a nutshell, to say that God is simple is to say in God, essence and existence coincide. To be God is not to be this or that. It's not to be this kind of being versus that kind of being. Everything else in our experience, from the highest to the simplest type of existent, is a hybrid of essence and existence. These are things that exist, but according to a mode. They exist according to a specific form. But God is not like that. When Moses asked in Exodus 3:14, when they ask me, what's your name, what shall I tell them? And the answer comes back, I am who I am. Moses is asking a very commonsensical question. It's a good philosophical question. Well, what kind of being are you? So if I'm asking your name and you give it to me, you're specifying which human being you are, right? Or if I were to say, now, what differentiates you from other animals? You would tell me. You would qualify your being. Well, who are you, God? I am who I am. Now, I think everything flows in a way from that. Once we understand this unique manner of God's being, we see all kinds of implications. And here's just one I'll point out now. We see God's non-competitiveness. If God is one being among many, even the highest, so there's you and me, and there's all kinds of other beings, and there's God as the highest being of them all, well, then all of us are against the same metaphysical background, if you want. We're all in the same genus of being, and we're necessarily jockeying for position within that framework. But if you say God is not en summum, that's Thomas for highest being, but rather ipsum esse, that means to be itself. Then we see, as Aquinas puts it, God is not in a genus, even the genus of being. But see, what that does is that it precludes God becoming a competitive being over and against us. And from that, I hope people can see, there's an enormous range of implications. God is not putting us down that he might be glorified. And that's where I would, in many dialogues I've had, engage Protestants, because I think very often, coming up out of Luther and Calvin, you do have a somewhat competitive view of the God-human relationship. So that if God gets all the glory, as indeed he should, well, then I shouldn't get glory. But I'm operating out of the St. Irenaeus perspective. Gloria Dei, the glory of God, is what? Homo vivens, is a human being fully alive. Well, that makes perfect sense on the assumption that God is simple, that God is not competing with us in a zero-sum game. That, if you want, is why I think that doctrine of the divine simplicity is so important.
Again, I think readers will especially enjoy that chapter. Not only do you lay out this defense of divine simplicity, but you also respond or anticipate some of the major objections against it that Craig and others have put forward. So highly recommend that one. That's part 2, Renewing Our Minds. Let's go now to part 3, Renewing Our Church. And this is where you tackle a lot of more ad intra questions about ecclesiology. You have a section on the sexual abuse crisis, another one on Imago Dei, the image of God. and then one on the virtue of magnanimity, which I thought was a great piece. But the one I want to talk about here is an essay you have on the renewal of the priesthood, and you focus specifically on the Vatican II document on the priesthood, Aetatem Totius. And this document, it's been 50 plus years since Vatican II proposed it. How has it been received? What more needs to be done to implement its vision? It's a question not a lot of people discuss. What did Vatican II have to say about the priesthood and how it's to be revived and reformed?
Yeah, and again, I'm grateful to be reminded of the occasion. That was a collection that my friend, and your friend too, Dr. Matthew Levering, put together. It was a series of essays on the Vatican II documents and their reception. So at the time, Matt was working with me at Mundelein Seminary. I was the rector at Mundelein. And he thought, well, here's a good candidate then to write on Optatum Totius, which, as you say, is about seminary formation. So I was bringing to bear not just my theological background, but my practical experience as a rector of the largest seminary in the country at the time. I put a special stress there on the reception of the document. The document is short. It's very good. It's very meaty. It passed. I was just rereading it last night. The vote was 2,305 to 3, I think. So it was overwhelmingly adopted by the Council Fathers. It reflects in many ways, Brandon, the Nouvelle Théologie. Those theologians like de Lubac and others who were influencing the council. It puts a great stress on the Bible in the formation of seminarians. Puts a great stress on the Church Fathers. It does say in a little famous ablative absolute, magistro Thoma, meaning with Thomas as master, as teacher. So it wants Aquinas to be a sort of touchstone. But it's interesting because it was departing from the approach that was common prior to the council, that Thomas was sort of the be-all and end-all of seminary formation. It was simply, the mind of Thomas on everything. Optatum Totius says, no, with Thomas as sort of the Rennian spirit, but we want to read a whole range of theologians, and especially back to the Bible. There's much more I could say about the document itself, but what I find really intriguing is the history of reception, because there was a lot of work done in the years after the council in seminary reform. And the great document of John Paul II, Pastores Dabo Vobis, right from the early 90s, became the Magna Carta for seminary people. And he lays out there the famous 4 pillars of formation. So every formation program in the country is predicated upon those 4 pillars. But you also see it's being received in John Paul II's audience talks. It's also received in the famous Program for Priestly Formation. Insiders call it the PPF. And the PPF, it's now version 6 is being considered by the Vatican as we speak, but it was version 5 when I was rector. And I used to teach from it and preach from it and use it for formation all the time. The PPF is trying to incarnate Pastores Dabo Vobis, which in turn incarnates Optatum Totius. So it started a very long and very rich tradition of seminary reform in our country and around the world. So yeah, read that little piece for some of those details.
Would you say that document has been fully received, that it's been fully applied? Does more still need to be done? Do we need to return to that document today when it comes to the priesthood?
Sure. No, and that's a good question, Brandon, because I would say with all the Vatican II documents, have they been fully received? I'd say no. I think the process of real reception of the council is still just beginning. I've said to you many times in these podcasts, there are a lot of elements of Vatican II that have not yet really been received. One of them being the biblical revival. I think we're trying, and I can point to a lot of things, but I don't think among the Catholic population generally, there's been the awakening in biblical knowledge that the council wanted. Another one, by the way, the reform of moral theology, which Vatican II called for. Yes, there have been great attempts over these decades. Has that really happened? I don't know. So, short answer is yes. We need to go back again and again to these great documents and then receive them according to our time, meaning in response to the concerns and questions of our time.
All right, let's move on to the fourth and final part of your new book, Renewing Our Hope. The fourth part is titled Renewing Our Culture, and here's where you focus on the more ad extra questions. You have an essay on Pope Francis's exhortation Amoris Laetitia, another one on the topic of relativism. You have the talk that you gave to the U.S. Congress on liberalism and Catholicism and the disconnect between those. But I want to focus on the very last essay in the book. It was previously published in the Oxford Handbook of Christology, so this big, 800, 900 page academic collection from all sorts of contributors. Your essay for the book was titled Christ in Cinema, The Evangelical Power of the Beautiful. And you do a really thorough analysis of 3 films in particular. One of them is Babette's Feast. The second one is The Shawshank Redemption. The third one is Gran Torino. We've talked a little bit about some of these films, especially Gran Torino before, but what's the value here of looking for Christ in cinema?
You know, it's funny you mentioned Babette's Feast because the actress who played Babette just died, I want to say a few months ago. And when I read that news, of course, it brought that film so vividly back to my mind. One of the great religious and Christological films of the last 50 years. I think, Brandon, it's a place where people are formed in today's culture. I think of music, I think of cinema, maybe above all, as places in the popular culture where people take in, now of course the social media too, where they take in their intellectual, moral, cultural formation. And so to look in the films for, I'll use Sokolovsky's image again, of the pieces of the Christian thing, often twisted and smoking, that have fallen after the great explosion, but you can find them very often in cinema. And from the beginning of my work on YouTube, the very first YouTube video I did was a commentary on Scorsese's The Departed. I've turned to film. In this chapter, I do it a little more technically and carefully, looking at these 3. But Babette's Feast, one of the great Christ figure images in recent cinema. All 3 are Christ figure images. Shawshank, which of course everybody knows, but Andy Dufresne, who once you start seeing the rhythm of that film, it's so obvious. And then of course Gran Torino, as I've said, the best, to my mind, best exemplification of the Christus Victor theory of how Jesus' cross saves us is in that film. So all 3 are these deeply Christ-haunted movies.
So again, I encourage viewers and listeners to pick up your copy of the book, 17 essays, over 320 pages, a delightful, rangy collection of scholarly talks and reflections. Again, it's titled Renewing Our Hope. You can find it at wordonfireshow.com/renew, and I highly encourage you to get a copy today. Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have a really interesting one from a convert from Hinduism, and she's asking about how to share and present Jesus as a singular incarnation contra the Hinduist view, which says that maybe God has incarnated himself in multiple ways. So here's the question.
Hello, my name is Radhika from Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm a convert from Hinduism. My question is, how do I dialogue with those who believe that Jesus is only one of many incarnations of God? For example, most Hindus believe in many incarnations of God, including Krishna and others. Hindus also believe that all religions lead to the same truth. How can I share with them the unique lordship of Christ? Thank you for all you do, and God bless.
Yeah, it's a great question, searching question. I might recommend, especially to the questioner, look at the work of Raimundo Panikkar. You know that name? You can tell from his sort of double name there, a Catholic and a Hindu, Raimundo Panikkar, because his parentage was mixed. It was Catholic and Hindu. And he becomes a Jesuit priest and theologian and did some really wonderful work, I thought, on thinking through the whole world religions issue. But one of his insights is that Hinduism, in many ways, is the great religion, if you want, of the Holy Spirit. He took the Trinitarian persons and applied them to the various religions. Buddhism, with this great stress on the kind of the void and the unknowability and the darkness and so on, was almost like a religion of the Father, because the Father is this sort of unoriginate, chthonic person. He thought like Judaism and Islam, with the stress on the Word, are more like religions of the Son. And he saw Hinduism as a religion of the Spirit, by which he meant what you're describing there, I think rightly, as these various incarnations, would be a bit like what we would hold about the way the Spirit is alive in a variety of people, and some more intensely than others. We call them saints, people in whom the Spirit is especially present. I think there's a qualitative difference between the claims being made about the divine presence in, the 10,000 places, I think as Hinduism puts it, and the claim being made about Jesus. Because there's a uniqueness and a totality about the claim that Jesus makes regarding himself, which has then been ratified by his resurrection from the dead. I think there's a qualitative difference between that, I and the Father are one, he who sees me sees the Father. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh, etc. A difference between that and what I'd call more of the manifestations of the Holy Spirit, which might obtain in a whole variety of people and places. Now, none of that is to gainsay that we can find a point of contact. We can find a real bridge to Hinduism precisely at that